This is the tale of the single lowest point in my existence. Although after a lot of thought on the matter, I've decided to share my experience with inhalants, mainly gasoline huffing. The following takes place over several months, so bear with me. I was 15 at the time, had just started a new school after being dismissed from my last one for drug paraphernalia. I'd started smoking pot the previous summer, but before starting at my new school, my dealer had moved away after nearly getting busted by the cops while I was there and fucked about face, but that's an experience for another day. So I was generally feeling quite down, plus on top of that I had just begun using Valium recreationally a few months before and was starting to fiend for it. Well, needless to say, I was on a slippery slope, and when I started school I found it was hard to find others I could relate to. Although I had a few close friends outside of school, I was beginning to feel more and more isolated. The experience. Although I had very few friends to speak of, during my time at the new school I had met another dude with similar interests, though in retrospect I wouldn't consider them a friend as I stopped talking to them long ago. After 4 to 5 weeks of sobriety, I was sitting at home, bored and desperate to catch a buzz, and with no cannabis around, I was keen to try anything. This was when B suggested that we try huffing gas. I had tried butane before, but at the time never even knew you can get high off of gas. Holy shit, you can get fucked up off of something I've had in my garage this whole time? I replied. Yeah man, I thought you would know that, replied B. So without much more forethought, we were up in the garage crouched over my dad's large red boat gas tank. Worst decision I've made and probably ever will. I unscrewed the large cap on the tank, and peering inside I asked B what the best way to do it was, to which he answered, "Just stick your nose in there and take the deepest breaths you can as quick as you can." I asked him to show me what he meant, and before I had finished the sentence, he had his nose in there huffing away. After what seemed like 20 or so tokes, he stood up with a very dazed look on his face, saying, "Fuck, you gotta try this, man." Well, seeing how inebriated B appeared to look, I immediately put my nose into the huge can and began to huff. The first few burned my nose so bad I had to stop mid-huff and take my nose out just to stop the burning. But soon the effects began to take hold, and by the time I had taken my 10th huff, I began to experience auditory hallucinations. These infamous noises are known as the ding-dings in my circle of friends. Other people who have tried inhalants will know what I mean. By the 20th hit, these ding-dings had increased to such an intensity it felt almost deafening, and as I stood up, a huge wave of the strange warm fuzziness hit me. It felt not unlike my previous experience with butane, although to a much greater degree with gas. As the high progressed, it began to take on more of a drunk quality, almost like sculling a six-pack, but with a slight rush to it. At this point, B and I were stumbling around my garden like lunatics, laughing at the absurdity of it all. Things in my peripheral vision began to shift, and I began to see what I can only explain as slight heat shimmering type visuals, like when you see heat coming off the road on a hot day. The delirium we were in soon began to taper off after this. I'd say the whole experience was only 10 minutes in all, including after effects. It was definitely not worth it if I had known what was coming later in life, but at the depths of depression, I was just stoked that I had found something that got me high. I didn't try gas again till the following weekend when after another miserable week at school I found myself fiending for that rush again. This may sound ridiculous, and in hindsight I can see how stupid it was, but at the time it seemed like all logical thought just went out the window. I either didn't think it would do me any harm, or I just didn't care, but either way I abused gasoline and to a lesser extent butane occasionally 3 to 4 times a month for the next 3 months until one night after a long huffing session I opened the garage door and began to walk down the garden path in a benzene-induced stupor, strung out in my own little world, and I failed to notice my dad standing on the deck outside his room. He was very anti-drug at the time, and we regularly had arguments over my habitual cannabis use when I was younger. He tried to talk to me, but I didn't hear for some reason. I had already walked around the corner when he followed me and asked what I was doing in the garage this late. I was so shocked to see him, and trying to maintain balance in my head spinning, I simply replied, "Having a ciggy." He told me to go to bed because it was Sunday and I had to get up for school, so I obliged and went to bed, but I knew I was in no mood for sleeping. I lay awake, my mind still racing from the close encounter. I thought a lot that night and stayed awake to enjoy the beautiful crimson sunrise. and as it came up over the islands in the distance, the cool autumn air soothed my ravaged lungs, and it was then that I sat and decided there were much more important things in life. I don't know entirely what caused it, but I made a conscious choice that dawn and have never used inhalants again since that night, a choice which I believe may very well have saved my life. The consequence. About 6 months after my epiphany, I was expelled from school, after a friend and I were caught smoking cannabis behind horticulture block, which wasn't really a big deal to me, still young and dumb. I just hated school. Anyway, so fast forward after 8 months, after several odd jobs with several different temp agencies, I had finally found a job I enjoyed, was good at, and had plenty of new hookups. Things were really starting to look up for me, and I was just proud to have finally got my life back on track. I was making money and in good health. Everything was choice. Then, it happened. I had been starting to develop back problems which had slowly been increasing in intensity over the last few days. Just shrugging it off, I had assured myself it was due to all the heavy lifting I had been doing at work, but deep inside I knew something wasn't right. Plus, it was getting worse and really beginning to impact my work. After taking the day off, the pain was getting really unbearable. My dad decided to call an ambulance to take me to a hospital as I had begun to develop a weird rash and I couldn't even walk to the car. Soon enough, I was in the back of the ambulance, sucking back nitrous oxide and having a merry old time, totally oblivious to what was right around the corner. When I arrived at the hospital, I immediately had a nurse walk up and start asking me questions about my symptoms. She asked to look at my rash and took a blood sample. Then I was wheeled into the ward like a lamb to the slaughter. After about an hour or so of waiting, we saw the curtain open, and as soon as I saw the concerned look on the nurse's face, I knew my life was about to change forever. "Your white cell count appears to be abnormally low. What do you think could be causing this?" I asked. "At this point, it appears you may have leukemia." I froze. It felt as though time stopped. The nurse continued talking, but I was just tuned out. 1,000 different scenarios ran through my head, and I perished every time. Eventually, the nurse walked out and the walls crumbled in on me. I couldn't breathe. Eventually, my mother's sobbing snapped me out of suspended animation. I was so sure I was going to die, I began to prepare my mind for the cold embrace. I knew what leukemia was. Well, at least I thought I did at the time. And at that moment, I felt as though I literally had months left. I was still sobbing in my mother's arms when the nurse appeared again and informed my father, I was inconsolable, that they needed a bone marrow sample to fully diagnose which type of leukemia I had. At this point, I had no idea there were more than one type of leukemia. So they heavily sedated me, took the sample, and then I was wheeled into the children's oncology ward. I was told they have the highest survival rate, and that's where I spent the single most terrifying night of my life. I lay there contemplating my own mortality at the tender age of 16. I felt as though I was on the brink of death. My life had run its course, and it was my time to go. Not something anyone should have to even think about at that age. Needless to say, I didn't sleep a wink that night, despite several high doses of lorazepam and a continuous patient-controlled morphine drip, which I eventually had confiscated because I kept hammering the button. The next morning brought rays of shimmering hope into the dark, abysmal world I'd been brooding in all night. Just before noon, my oncologist came in and explained that the particular strain of leukemia I had is called ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, quite easily curable and has a very high survival rate. It felt as though several tons were lifted from my shoulders. I was overjoyed. It was like I'd been given a second chance to live, and that's the way I still see it to this day. What I was feeling was indescribable. I had gone from preparing myself for death to just jumping for joy just to be alive. My oncologist spent several hours explaining my treatment phases to me, that I would have to have a 3-year-long course of chemotherapy to prevent it from coming back. This daunted me, but I was so stoked that I was going to live that I would have crawled a mile over broken glass to get rid of it. She also explained that if I had left it much longer, I would be facing a more malignant diagnosis, and that usually my age group, 16 and up, didn't fare too well with other types of leukemia. I felt so lucky that I had an easily treatable type, but also a deep empathy and sorrow for those others, one of which I would meet during the 2 weeks I initially spent in the ward. Then I asked the million-dollar question, what could have caused it? She explained they weren't entirely sure, but asked if I had been swimming near mangroves. I said no. And the very next question was, have you spent much time around solvent fumes at work? I froze. It suddenly appeared so obvious to me. No, not really, I replied. Why's that? Is that known to cause it? She explained that certain solvents such as toluene and, as I recently found out, benzene causes leukemia. I clicked and it suddenly made sense to me. I had brought it on myself. Although this might appear a bit controversial, here are the facts so you can make your own conclusion. From Wikipedia, benzene causes leukemia and is associated with other blood cancers and precancers of the blood. As a gasoline additive, benzene increases the octane rating and reduces knocking. The conclusion. So here I am, alive, well, active, and almost 2 years into my treatment. I lost all my hair a few months after starting chemo, and it's now grown back very thick and curly, albeit a bit slowly. I am now real keen to get back into work and have been job seeking the past few months. Being diagnosed with leukemia has been the scariest and most intense time of my life. It has changed me in a deep, profound way as I have gone from abusing my body and mind, making my parents' life a living hell, and just generally taking the great life I had for granted, and now to enjoying every day to its absolute fullest, respecting myself and others, and most importantly, I now know what it truly means to be alive. Personally, I feel this was a classic case of karma. I didn't give a flying fuck about myself or anyone else, and I took it all for granted. So the universe just dealt me a mean dose of cause and effect to kick my ass into gear. It's been quite a learning curve. Though thinking back on it, I wouldn't have swapped my experience for the world, because it has gave me something priceless, a deep respect for life, not just my own, but all those around me. As they say, what doesn't kill you can only make you stronger.